Okay, so this is going to be basically the rest of the civil rights lecture, just the piece for like sort of the peak 1963 to 1965, which we sort of started yesterday in class. And I'm going to go flip around here. So obviously we left off in class where we talked about, I'm just kind of going back in time here. We just about gotten to Martin Luther King Jr. So let's just sort of make sure that we wind up talking about the Montgomery bus boycott just a little bit more, obviously. And you've read about this in several different places, so I don't want to, belabor the point about what you need to know. But the boycott takes about, more than a year. It's 382 days, right? And in order to, it basically is one step in the early period. So this is really this is not the peak, but this is getting to the peak, right, of the movement. Demonstrates the willingness of black citizens in the South to join together to sort of fight oppression. Okay. Martin Luther King Jr. is obviously one of the most recognizable names in the civil rights movement, although certainly he's not like the only one involved, which is kind of the sense that we get sometimes. But his contributions and his leadership in and of itself springboards the movement into sort of like high gear. Although I would suggest that the willingness of people like Eisenhower and Kennedy, although initially reluctant, their willingness to support the judicial branch's interpretation of laws definitely also supports and lends strength to people like Martin Luther King Jr. Well-educated pastor, and that obviously plays a major role in his charisma and his ability to deliver speeches and sort of inspire, because a lot of his speeches, if you listen to them, sound like sermons. And so at this point, you have seen what Martin Luther King Jr. is up against in terms of segregation, because you've already watched that Segregation at All Costs video with Bull Connor, which is linked, obviously, on its learning. I mean, you're going to be actually, once you're done listening to me talk about this and watch this, there's a series of videos or links actually from a really incredibly famous series called Eyes on the Prize that documents very carefully the civil rights movement, beginning in sort of the early 50s all the way to the mid 70s. But anyway, Martin Luther King Jr. is all about nonviolence, civil disobedience, obviously inspired by Gandhi and people like Henry David Thoreau. He helps organize the Montgomery bus boycott. He emerges as the de facto leader. And one of his most famous speeches, not favorite, maybe it's his favorite, is the I Have a Dream speech, which I'm really honestly not going to go into too much depth about, because I think it communicates obviously a lot of values. But this is sort of like the culmination of the March on Washington, which is an incredible moment in which Kennedy allows people to march. 200,000 people, both black and white, participate in this, and it's trying to agitate for a civil rights bill, and winds up actually resulting in a civil rights bill. And the I Have a Dream speech has this very sort of lyrical quality to it, in which he sounds like he's almost delivering a sermon, which is like very moving. So he talks, but this is sort of built upon these earlier statements in which he talks about his methods. So for homework, you have to look at sort of the letter from the Alabama clergyman who claim, essentially, if you looked at that, you understood that what are those guys saying? They're saying that his refusal to obey the law is creating more harm than good, and really opposes his decisions in terms of leading black citizens to agitate for social and political equality. And he's in jail when he gets this. He reads, obviously, their condemnation of him, and he responds with Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which is probably one of the more famous documents in American history, and certainly of the 20th century, in which he outlines the responsibility that human beings have to challenge unfair and unjust laws. And the idea that, refusing to obey unjust laws he says the failure to challenge unjust laws is in and of itself a crime, right? So it has nothing to do, and he says, we can't be complacent, but we can't be angry and vengeful, which is starting to happen. You're starting to see the emergence of, which we're going to be talking about in class on Thursday, the sort of the really angry disillusionment that culminates in the Black Panther movement, which is not just about militancy and anger. It's about, creating a really solid Black community to fend for themselves. But we'll talk about that on Thursday. But his letter from a Birmingham jail, which you read, obviously addresses the critiques that those 8 Alabama white clergymen had against him. He is obviously eventually assassinated, which is, 1968 is a really hard, tough year in terms of the civil rights movement, but obviously really probably one of the most powerful leaders of the movement, is certainly in the 60s. So when he comes into power, when he's writing the letter, when he is organizing the March on Washington, this is seen as sort of like the pinnacle of the sort of peaceful, nonviolent movement. So the SCLC organizes all sorts of nonviolent protests. So this is all about, well, there's 2 reasons for this, I think. And I think this is, if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense politically. White people are terrified of Black violence. And this has been a fear, this goes to, sort of like fear of slave rebellions, right? Like Nat Turner and all that kind of stuff, Stoner Rebellion. And so I think there's a conscious effort on the part of Black leaders to be nonviolent, certainly probably because they believe in nonviolence as Baptists, but they also probably believe that in order to ingratiate themselves in the wider white public, they need to be as sympathetic as possible. And you're going to engender a lot more sympathy with not fighting back. And this is smart and this works because, when people see on TV these horrifying images of Black men, women, and children being attacked with fire hoses and German shepherds, it's so horrifying as to and generates and elicits a major response by people who necessarily might not have cared. So the media plays a major role in allowing nonviolence and civil disobedience to become successful. Because watching someone get hit repeatedly and not strike anyone back is incredibly moving. And you think back to that scene in the movie Gandhi, which I think that you probably watched in 9th grade. I think you watched it in 8th grade anyway, where Gandhi, in the face of like horrible physical violence, still commits to his purpose is like overwhelmingly like amazing, right? Who's going to argue with that? Racist people, obviously, but that's not what this is intended to do. Like they're not trying to convince racists not to be racists. They're convincing the people who are on the fence, right? Which is actually the majority of white Americans, especially in the North and the West. All right, so we talked about this. This is really long. The 8 Alabama clergymen critique him. Oh, and this is the big thing, is that they want this to be in the courts, not in the streets. They believe that this is leading to mayhem, and basically, King is like, well, I don't really care. We need mayhem. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. But he's not advocating violence. He is advocating persistent nonviolence. March on Washington, that should not say 20,000. That should say 200,000, by the way. So fix that in your notes. Because I think we're at letter, we talked about this. Okay. I Have a Dream speech. We talked about that, right? This is the climax of the day. Everyone goes, there's this really famous scene. And again, a lot of the videos that I linked for you, I think there's going to be 4 or 5 of them, capture these moments pretty clearly. So the speech that he makes is incredibly memorable because it cites a series of very powerful documents that have now become kind of like icons in American history. So obviously, a Judeo-Christian nation, he cites passages from the Bible, the Declaration of Independence, which is probably No more I think the Declaration of Independence is probably more cited, honestly, than the Constitution. And then the Emancipation Proclamation, which obviously, anything associated with Abraham Lincoln is going to, do well. So you have these really stunning comments that, and also it is really poetic and it's really powerful. And so he's an incredible orator. And one of the reasons he is so successful is his ability to communicate really moving ideas as a sermon. Like, he's really delivering a sermon is what he's doing. So what happens as a result of this? Because the March on Washington is hugely influential. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this is where we have the legislative branch obviously lending support. Kennedy has been assassinated by this point, but Johnson, who is a white Southerner, which is ironic, is pretty supportive of these ideas. So you have employers cannot discriminate on the basis of race, sex, and religion. The Voting Rights Act and the 24th Amendment are both ways to eliminate the practice of denying black men and women the right to vote, which has pretty much been in place since not even the end of Reconstruction, because obviously Reconstruction efforts to make sure that blacks were voting it kind of dwindles by the very end of Reconstruction. So the fact that the United States federal government is behind this is pretty powerful. So this is why the 1963 and 1965 is seen as the peak of the movement, because it's seen as civil disobedience and nonviolence work. And it works for a certain reason. The media has a lot to do with this. And it works in that you actually see tangible results through these three pieces of legislation. And this is kind of where we wrap up our lecture. So what I would do if I were you, where it says letter from a Birmingham jail and you have some stuff in there, I would make specific references. If you look back, the Birmingham letter, you also have it, right? So that's the letter itself where these things are underlined. I think I would write these things down, like injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed. And Birmingham, by the way, when he says this, Birmingham is the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. So they're coming up against a really angry white population. Obviously, remember the Bull Connor video. But it actually pays dividends through the passage of these pieces of legislation. Whether or not how well they're enforced, we'll obviously talk about in more depth on Thursday, because another movement develops, although it had earlier roots, another movement develops in the mid to late 60s that sort of challenges the assumptions that are put forth by people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. All right, so now what I would do is I would sort of wrap this up, and I would check for the links, and I put the links of the videos in order, and I also indicated what parts of the video that you should watch, because you don't want to watch the whole thing. Certainly, each episode is basically like an hour, and there's like 11 hours, 11 total episodes. So I'll link to the video, but I will indicate in its learning what part of the video I want you to watch, and then you can watch that at your leisure. Okay, I hope this helped.